For a native plant garden or a wildlife garden, it is very important to follow the seasonal changes and align our gardening tasks according to the seasons, because the plants and the seedlings that are sprouting in your garden, or the butterflies that are about to emerge, or the birds that have started to come in, they are all strictly following the seasons. So if our gardening tasks in how we do them, or when and what we do, if those are also aligned with the rest of the changes that are going on with the wildlife and the plants, then it becomes much easier for the garden to thrive. And many of these seasonal tasks are quite different from what you do for other types of gardens, like vegetable gardening or other non-native ornamental gardens. So let's talk about spring season activities for nature gardening. Welcome to another episode of Garden and Nature Southwest. I am Vani Shukla. Let's start with growing new plants or adding new plants to the garden, because after all, spring is about growing new plants. An obvious one is, of course, getting new plants from nursery or starting from seeds, but there's one more resource that we don't want to miss, and that is to look around in our own backyard, in all of the open spaces that we have around our house, to take a look at what is sprouting. So even though if there's a plant that you've always considered a weed, if you do not know what exactly that plant is, then identify that, because some of them may turn out to be wildflowers. If you think about it, the milkweed plant that the monarch caterpillars use, these milkweed plants were being removed because they were considered weeds. Now these plants are being sold in nurseries. There might be so many other plants that we consider as weeds, but they may be wildflowers. They may not be invasives. What I would consider true weeds would be invasive non-native plant. So it is good to identify any of these plants and to learn about them and to see if they're native to our local area, to the bigger geographical area that you live in, and if you can find more information about what other species depend on those plants. If you have all that information about a plant, then it will be easier to make a decision whether to leave that plant in your garden or to remove that. Now, this resource where you're trying to find plants in your garden, or even when you're walking in your neighborhood and finding plants maybe in those parking strips which are next to the sidewalks, sometimes you will see a lot of weeds growing there. Occasionally you might come across one or two native plants there. Same thing goes with empty lots as well. So it is good to take pictures and identify what those plants are. There are several apps these days. I've been using iNaturalist, but there are several other apps these days. And nowadays the iPhone's own photo app also has a feature where under the photo, if you look at it, there's a information icon and you click on it and it will say look up plant. So that will also give you some suggestions. But anytime you get any suggestion from any app, also confirm it independently on other websites. And then look at its native range. Where is it found naturally? A lot of times you will find that it's naturalized, but it was introduced from Europe or Asia. But there are other plants that you will find are native to Northwest, and some are native to only Southwest region, or there might be some that are native to your local region. These plants may not be found in nurseries. They might be very local to your geographical area. Nurseries often grow the plants that are easy to propagate. So the plants that we find in nurseries are going to be limited compared to what's out there, what's out in nature. It's a very limited number of collection, and most of us will be growing the same. So in order to increase the plant diversity in our garden, this resource, I think, is something that we don't want to miss. As more and more land is being lost to construction and to development, some of these plants will be lost because they're so local to that area. So from that standpoint also, it becomes important. Now, in your own garden, you have the benefit of observing these plants for a little bit longer, because sometimes it gets very difficult to identify these plants when they're really young. When they have only 2 or 3 leaves, they can be difficult to identify or confirm 100% that that's what you're looking at. So what you can do is put a few rocks around the plant so it is not accidentally stepped on, and keep checking on it every few days as it grows. It might be easier to identify. If you're living near a natural wild area, then it becomes even more important. Near a natural area doesn't mean you're living right next to it. It might be even in a few miles radius, because some of these seeds are brought in by birds. So definitely one of the important things in spring is to observe your garden, to observe the spaces in your garden where new plants are sprouting up. Another important resource is again in your own garden, and that is the plants that have reseeded. Now that might not sound very important, but it is for native plants, for some of the native plants at least, because some of them are very picky where they grow, what sites they like. So if you happen to have a certain plant that somehow made it in your garden, now if it reseeds, then just leave it there. Let me give you an example. I was trying to grow a Mexican gold poppy, which is a subspecies of the California poppy. The Mexican gold poppy is the native of the Chihuahuan desert. I somehow found the seeds online on the Native Seeds website, and I will leave the links in the show notes. So I found those seeds, I grew them in pots indoors, and I threw many seeds outdoors in my garden, in my backyard, side yards, front yard, everywhere. And the seeds germinated fine indoors, but when I put them outdoors, when I transplanted them, they didn't do well, and they eventually died. And the seeds that I had thrown, none of them sprouted, not even the following year. 2 years went by, and in 2023, that's when I saw 2 or 3 plants just showed up from underneath the rocks. I just let them grow there, because if they were finding so difficult to grow in my garden, then even if 2 of them are happy, let them be there. So they probably reseeded, and the following year, I had many more plants in the same area. Now this year, I have more than the previous year, and a couple of them have shown up even much further from this particular area. So I'm very happy about that. They're now spreading more in my garden. So more difficult a plant is to grow, or if you have a plant that is rare or is difficult to find in nurseries and you somehow have it in your garden, then definitely in spring season, look around in your garden, see what's sprouting. And sometimes it is much further away from the original plant that a new plant might sprout. So definitely keep an eye out for that. But whether you want to leave them there in the place that they grew in, or whether you want to transplant, that depends on how rare that plant is, or how many of these plants that you have in your garden. If you have only a few, or only just one sprouted, just leave it there. Just protect it and wait till next year, till you have many more. And then you can risk transplanting it elsewhere, because some of these native plants do not do well with transplanting. And if you are transplanting, if you are moving a plant, a small tip that can help is do that in the evening. Or if there's a forecast for rain, showers, cooler temperatures, do it at that time. Because if you move that plant in the morning, then in a couple of hours, it's going to be exposed to higher temperature, to sun. So it might be better in the evening, or if you have more pleasant weather coming up in the next few days, then just plan for those days. So the next thing for new plants that you do not want to miss in spring is any native plant sale that might be going around in your area. So look up for native plant societies that you have in your region, and they might have information on the native plant sale, or just Google native plant sale in your city and something will show up. Also look up for online nurseries, because spring is the time when many new plants are in stock and are being shipped. Now, so far we have talked about the plants that are growing in your garden that you want to have in your garden, that you want to have more of. Let's move on to the plants that you've had enough of. These are some of the native plants that can become quite aggressive in the garden because they just love your garden too much. They will spread everywhere. And spring is the time when you want to pay close attention to that, because if you pull them out as soon as they're sprouting, as soon as you identify that that's the plant, you pull them out, it's much easier than to go after it 2 months later when the roots are much deeper, then you'll have to dig, and especially if your soil is difficult to dig into, they can be very difficult to pull out. In my garden, desert broom and snakeweed were a couple of these plants that were very difficult to deal with. And I ended up finally removing them completely from my garden because it was becoming very, very difficult to manage. Now, there are many other plants that move around in the garden quite easily, and they reseed so freely and they are found everywhere. For example, desert marigold. But I don't want to get rid of that completely from my garden because it's easy to pull out. So if I don't want it at a certain place, I just pull it out. It's just so easy to pull it out. And I can leave them where I want them. In 2023, there was a strip in my garden where I left a lot of desert marigolds, and it was like a mass planting, and they just looked beautiful. So these plants, which are easy to pull out, but they reseed freely, they give you a lot of flexibility because every year you can create some sort of a new design if you want to using those plants. But the plants that are very difficult to pull out, they can make gardening difficult. Mexican feathergrass is another one that can create a little bit of difficulty in the garden. It's not that it's difficult to pull out, it's actually fairly easy to pull it out. But it will find any place to grow. And when it starts to grow right from the base of another plant, if it's a small plant, that plant also might completely get pulled out when you're trying to pull out this grass. So that's the problem that I'm finding. Or when it starts to grow from underneath the sotol or any other cacti with sharp spines, then it's very difficult to get the grass out from those areas. So even though I really love the Mexican feathergrass, I've been growing this for the last 4 or 5 years now, but it's very tiring to keep pulling it out from all over the place, especially when it's growing from the middle of other plants. That's what makes it more difficult. Chocolate flowers are very beautiful and they are fragrant, especially in spring. They also reseed very freely, and they are a little bit more difficult to get out, and more so from the rocky soil. If you don't have a rocky soil, then it may not be that difficult. But in my garden, it's a rocky soil and it is difficult to get them out. But it is always a balance that you have to find for yourself. And even though these are difficult to get out, I am not completely getting rid of them from my garden. The main thing is to pull them out early from the areas that you don't want them in. The Mexican evening primrose is another one that can be quite aggressive. Now, if any of these plants are making your gardening difficult and you do not want them in your garden, then also keep an eye on any nursery plants, any nursery pots that you bring in, because sometimes these plants or any other weeds or any other invasives as well may hitchhike on the nursery plants. So keep an eye on those as well. So these are the native plants that can be aggressive in your garden. But spring is the time when most plants and seeds are in their growing phase. So look out for the weeds and the invasive plants also, especially. It's much easier to pull them out now in springtime. It's much easier before their roots take hold. Now, so far, we have talked about the decisions that we make regarding the new plants that are coming in the garden. Now, let's move to the caring for plants that we already have in our garden. What kind of special attention that we need to pay when we are pruning these plants or managing the growth of these plants. When we are thinking about pruning any other plant, any non-native plant, let's say it's a fruit tree or any other non-native perennial, we often just think about in terms of plants. How is the plant going to perform when we prune at a certain time? But when it comes to native plants, and I think it should be true for other plants too, but it is even more true for the native plants, that when we are thinking about pruning a native plant, we also have to think about, is it going to be in the best interest of the wildlife that is dependent on that plant? So, for example, there are many native plants and grasses that you just want to leave them in the winter. You do not want to cut them or remove any dead or dried material, because there might be insects that are going into their dormant stages. There might be butterfly chrysalis. There might be many other tiny creatures that are dependent on those dried material on the plants. For the same reason, when the springtime is around, we do not want to rush to prune. Even though the plants might be showing some new growth, But if the temperatures are quite cold in the evening time, if it's less than 40 degrees oftentimes at night time, you don't want to rush to prune at that time, because there still might be insects in their dormant stages of their life cycle that are hiding and very nicely camouflaged in that dried plant material. And when the nights start to warm up and you decide to prune, the plant is having new growth, even then I would suggest just cutting and dropping those dried leaves and dried branches, just drop them down in the same place rather than removing them, and definitely not to pass them through a mulcher. Because throughout the spring season, different insects, different kinds of butterflies, different kinds of moths, and so many other insects, they are coming out of their dormant stages of their life cycle. They're coming out of it at different times in spring. So if you just drop the sticks and the dried leaves right in the place, then there's more chance that these dormant stages of the life cycle of various insects will stay protected. And that way you will have a much healthier population of these beautiful butterflies or many other insects. You will have a healthier population there. Now, whenever we talk about insects, not everybody is comfortable about that thought of having a lot of insects in the garden. But in a healthy garden, your garden is never going to be taken over by the insects, because there should be a healthy balance, and that balance is going to happen automatically by itself over time as the garden grows. More insects are going to bring in a lot of birds. They're going to bring in lizards. So definitely leave all the dried leaves and other sticks and twigs right in the place. And it's good to have garden paths to work on your plants, or to have stepping stones. If the plants are further away from the paths, then have some stepping stones to reach those plants, so that you're not stepping on the ground where the dried leaf and other dried plant material is. So that's delaying the pruning for the wildlife benefit. But also there's another reason sometimes I delay pruning, is to protect the plants from cold winds. Because with the strong winds, those soft, tender, new branches that are coming up, they just fall over. But if you have the old branches that are still standing, then they can sometimes act as a stake for the new branches. And all those dried leaf material that is still on the plants, that provides a little bit of warmth and wind protection to the new plant growth that's just starting to happen in that plant. So for that reason also, I delay pruning a little bit till the nights start to warm up. Now let's talk about a related thing to pruning, is mulching, keeping the ground mulched. Because what you're pruning will eventually become the mulch on the ground. And for most of the native plants, that is usually adequate. You don't need to get extra mulch from outside. The exception is if you're just starting your garden. You have bare land, you don't have any plant material before. That is the only time you will probably bring some mulch from outside, because native plant gardens, especially in the southwest region, do not require a whole lot of heavy, thick mulching. Most of the plants are okay without a whole lot of organic matter, and the organic matter that builds up gradually just from the falling leaves and dried out branches, that is usually adequate. So only if you have a very new garden, then maybe a thin layer of maybe some wood chips, pecan mulch, anything, but not a very heavy, thick layer, very, very small amount. But another way to keep the grounds covered, and that is, I think, very essential to have in any native plant garden, is to have ground cover, like live ground cover, live plants that spread on the ground. Because they do two things. The plant is growing at the ground surface, it's providing that protection to the soil, covering the soil. At the same time, it is providing additional benefit to the wildlife. For example, frog fruit, it can be host to a number of butterflies. So growing ground cover plants is definitely an essential element of a healthy, thriving native plant garden. So when it comes to pruning and mulching, the covering the ground, one essential difference from other types of gardening is we do not want to think of spring garden activities for native garden as garden cleanup. We do not want to clean up. The only cleanup we probably want is areas that we walk on, the areas that are the seating areas. Those are probably the only areas that we want to clean, but we do not want to clean and remove plant material from the plant beds. For the larger plants in your garden, when you're pruning them and it's not possible to drop all those large branches right in place and leave them in place, of course, that's not practical for a garden. And in that case, what you do is you just put them aside in a different place in the garden. And then when it's much warmer, maybe in the summer season, you can mulch them. And that way, any dormant stages of insects, any chrysalis on those branches, they will not get damaged. So we've talked about pruning and mulching, and now let's move to a related thing, that is fertilizing. I say related because mulching provides a lot of fertilization too over time, because it is building up that organic matter. Now, fertilizing is also a bit different from when you're dealing with a vegetable garden or a non-native ornamental garden, because these types of gardens usually require a lot of organic matter. This is not true for all kinds of native plants. We're talking about Southwest only. Of course, native plants growing in Northwest may require a lot more organic matter. So we're talking about Southwest, and the plants that are native to desert climate would require least amount of added organic matter from outside. What is falling on the ground, and it gradually builds up. That thin layer, which might seem like nothing when you compare to a vegetable garden, that amount is usually adequate. But we may have native plants that are from a little bit further. For example, you might have some plants that are coming from near the river in your town. They're riparian plants, and they may require a bit different soil. So you might have to add some organic matter to certain plants. So always good to know what the natural habitat of that plant is. And when you look at the natural habitat of the plant, try to see how much organic matter usually that plant has. If it's growing mainly in very alkaline, rocky soil, limestone kind of soil, usually they're not very rich in organic matter. If it's a plant that grows close to the river, or if it's growing in higher altitudes or in areas where it rains more than your area, then for those plants, add some compost, a thin layer of compost every year, till your plant is really a good size that it's dropping quite a bit of leaves and branches, and they themselves create a good amount of organic matter each year. Till that stage, those plants may need some organic matter added in the springtime. But again, not as much, not as heavy as the vegetable plants or other non-native plants need. And we definitely want to stay away from any sort of chemical or artificial fertilizing, because that is not in the best interest of the plants, the soil, the microlife in the soil, and all the wildlife that comes to your garden. It's in the long run, it's not good for that whole ecosystem. Now, the last item that I want to mention in the spring gardening activities, and that is not to forget, is collecting the seeds from some of the plants that are from the winter time. If there's an uncommon plant, if there's a rare plant in your garden, don't collect all the seeds from that plant. Collect only a few, because again, that plant, when it reseeds by itself, it has a better chance of growing compared to when we are trying to grow it in a certain condition. So today's focus was mainly on the plants in a wildlife garden, but in the next episode, I will focus on the tasks specifically for wildlife, even though in reality, it is impossible to separate the two. Plants and the wildlife, they're all one system, they're all one garden. But just so that we are able to cover most of the important tasks that are needed in springtime, I just divided them into plant focus, and in the next one, I can cover some of the important tasks that we need to do specifically for birds, the pollinators, the other insects, other small creatures. So there are many other things that can help us enjoy this springtime and can help us create a healthier habitat. So some important points from today's episodes are that we want to keep an eye on the new plants that are coming up, because these plants that are sprouting up in spring in our gardens and in our neighborhoods, some of these can be uncommon plants. And even if they are common, they are adding to the diversity of plants that you have in your garden. Next, we want to pay attention to how and when we prune. Also, we want to keep our grounds covered by leaving the plant materials that we have pruned or has dropped from the existing plants, and grow ground covers for additional benefits to the wildlife. And definitely no need for any chemical fertilizers or any artificial fertilizers. Whatever is dropping on the ground as far as the plant material is usually enough for most of the desert plants. But if there are native plants from areas that have higher organic matter than your soil, then add some organic matter in form of compost. One additional thing that I completely forgot to mention in this episode was about irrigation. It is also time to adjust the irrigation, and if you have plants already established in your garden growing for a few years, for example, if it's a mesquite tree and you do not want it to grow really big, then it's time to cut down on the irrigation. At the same time, if there are plants that you want to promote growth, promote extra growth on, then adjust the irrigation to a little bit more during the springtime. I can probably talk about it a little bit more in the next episode. So that is all for today. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.